Tonight, we celebrate new beginnings, starting with my own freedom. Here are the divorce papers, Imani.
The rain started the moment Sterling Knox stepped onto the stage, though no one inside the Aurelius Grand Ballroom could have known that, because inside there was only light, chandeliers dripping crystal, 300 of the most powerful people in the city seated at round tables draped in ivory linen, cameras angled toward the podium where a banner read Aurelius Foundation, 20 years of giving back. Imani Vale sat at the front table in a pale blue gown, her hands folded in her lap, smiling the way she always smiled at these events. Warm, a little distant, like she was standing just behind her own face. She had learned, over 11 years of marriage, exactly how much of herself to show a room like this. Enough to be gracious, not enough to be interesting. Interesting drew questions, and questions were the one thing Imani Vale had spent her entire adult life quietly avoiding. She did not know that tonight. None of that would matter. Sterling adjusted the microphone. He was 51 years old and looked, under the ballroom lights, exactly like what he'd spent 3 decades building himself into. A man who belonged in rooms like this one. Silver at the temples. A jaw that photographed well. A smile that had closed 100 boardroom deals and opened 1,000 magazine profiles. "Thank you all for coming," he said, and the room quieted the way rooms quiet for men who are used to being listened to. 20 years ago, I started with nothing but a used truck and a loan I couldn't afford. Tonight, the Aurelius Foundation has given away $400 million to causes that matter. And I want to be honest with you tonight. Brutally honest. Because that's who I am. Imani's smile did not move. But something behind her eyes did. A small flicker. The kind of flicker you'd only notice if you had spent 50 years learning to watch for exactly that kind of thing. Which, 3 tables back, an elderly man in a plain black suit did notice. He set down his water glass very quietly and did not pick it up again. For 11 years, Sterling continued, I've built an empire while carrying a burden I never spoke about publicly. My marriage. A ripple went through the room. A soft intake of collective breath, the particular hunger of powerful people watching another powerful person's private life become public entertainment. Imani has been a wonderful companion. But companionship isn't partnership. And a man in my position needs a partner who can stand beside an empire, not just decorate it. Someone at a nearby table actually gasped. Imani did not. So tonight, Sterling said, reaching into his jacket, in front of everyone who matters to me, I'm finalizing what should have happened years ago. He produced a folded document and set it on the podium with the theatrical care of a man who had rehearsed this in a mirror. Imani, please come up. For one full second, nobody in the ballroom moved. Then Imani rose, smooth, unhurried, the fabric of her gown falling into place like it had been waiting for this exact moment, and walked to the stage in low silver heels that made no sound on the marble. Everything you've ever enjoyed came from me, Sterling said to her, quiet enough that the microphone almost didn't catch it, loud enough that it did. The house, the clothes, the car. The name people say with respect at galas like this one. I built it. I gave it to you. And now I'm asking for it back. He held out his hand. The ring. Imani looked down at the band on her finger, the one he'd slid on 11 years ago at a courthouse, before there were galas, before there was an empire, when they'd split a diner breakfast afterward because neither of them could afford anything nicer. She slipped it off and placed it in his palm. The watch. She unclasped it. A Cartier, a 40th birthday gift he'd given her with a toast about forever. She set it beside the ring. The shoes. A murmur went through the crowd now. Uneasy, some of them starting to sense this had crossed from spectacle into something uglier. Imani bent, unstrapped the silver heels, and stood barefoot on the cold marble stage in front of 300 witnesses and a wall of cameras. The car keys are in the valet's booth, Sterling said. I've already told them not to bring the car around for you again. And then, the moment the elderly man in the black suit had been waiting 50 years to see, though nobody watching knew it yet, Imani lifted her chin, looked Sterling directly in the eyes, and asked, in a voice so calm it silenced the last murmur in the room. "Are you certain this is how you want history to remember tonight?" Sterling laughed. A short, dismissive bark. The kind of laugh a man gives when he has already decided the woman in front of him has no leverage left to threaten him with. "History," he said, "will remember that I built something out of nothing. What you do after tonight isn't history. It's not even a footnote." She held his gaze one more moment. Then she turned, walked off the stage, past 300 faces frozen between horror and fascination, past the cameras that would make this the most watched clip on every entertainment channel by morning, and out through the ballroom's tall glass doors into a city that had just started to rain. She did not look back once. If you're watching this story unfold and you already feel something tightening in your chest, that's good. That's exactly where I need you. Go ahead and hit subscribe now so you don't miss a single moment of what's coming. Drop a like if you're already rooting for her, and tell me in the comments where in the world you're watching from tonight. Because what Sterling Knox doesn't know, what none of those 300 people in that ballroom knew, is that the woman he just humiliated in front of the entire city has spent her whole life being watched by people far more powerful than him. And tonight, for the first time in 50 years, they finally have their answer. Rain in this city did not fall gently. It came sideways, in sheets, driven by wind that funneled between the glass towers like the buildings themselves were exhaling. Imani stood at the curb outside the Aurelius Grand for nearly a full minute, letting it soak through the pale blue silk before she started walking. She had no phone. Sterling's assistant had quietly collected it from her clutch 2 days earlier under the pretense of syncing the new calendar app, and Imani, who had noticed but said nothing, understood now exactly what that had really been. She had no money. She had no shoes. What she had was 11 years of practice at looking composed while the ground shifted beneath her, and she used every year of it now, walking 6 blocks through the downpour with her bare feet stinging against wet concrete, her chin level, her shoulders back, because there were still cameras out here, freelance photographers who chased ambulances and scandals with equal enthusiasm, and she was not going to give them the photograph they wanted. She let herself feel it once she reached the train station. Not tears. Imani Vale had not cried in front of another human being since she was 9 years old, and she was not about to start under fluorescent lights in a nearly empty transit hall at 11 at night. What she felt instead was something colder and stranger, a kind of vertigo, the sensation of an entire structure she'd spent a decade living inside quietly revealing itself to have been built on nothing at all. She sat on a metal bench near the ticket machines, soaked through, barefoot, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, entirely without a plan. That was when the janitor found her. He was an old man, 70 at least, pushing a yellow mop bucket with a wheel that squeaked in 3/4 time. He wore a name tag that said Walter and a cardigan under his uniform vest despite the summer heat. And when he saw her sitting there, barefoot, drenched, staring at nothing, he stopped the bucket, studied her for a long moment with an expression she couldn't quite place, and then said, in a voice gone soft with something like recognition, "Little Sparrow." Imani's head came up sharply. Nobody had called her that in 22 years. Nobody alive was supposed to know that name at all. It had been her grandmother's, whispered only in the kitchen of a farmhouse 3 states away. Only ever between the two of them, a private joke about a girl who used to perch on windowsills and watch the world like she was deciding whether it was safe to fly down into it. "What did you say?" Imani asked, and her voice, for the first time all night, was not steady. Walter set down the mop handle. He crouched, carefully, the way old knees require, until he was closer to her eye level. "Your grandmother," he said, "asked us to watch over you. All of us. For a long time now." He reached into his cardigan pocket and produced, of all things, a small folded square of cloth, worn soft at the creases, and held it out to her. It was a handkerchief, monogrammed, the letters EV stitched in faded gold thread. Imani stared at it like it might burn her fingers. "Evelyn Vale," she whispered. "Your grandmother," Walter confirmed, "was the finest woman I ever had the privilege of serving." And tonight, he glanced toward the station doors, toward the rain, toward the direction of the ballroom she'd just walked out of. "Tonight, I think, is the night we've all been waiting 50 years for." Waiting for what? Imani's voice cracked on the last word, all her carefully maintained composure finally beginning to fray at the edges. "Walter, who are you? Who are all of us? My grandmother died when I was 19. She was a school teacher. She lived in a four-room farmhouse." She didn't. Imani stopped herself, because even as she said it, some old unexamined part of her mind was already contradicting her. The farmhouse that had never once, in her entire childhood, needed a single repair paid for out of pocket. The lawyer who'd shown up at the funeral in a car too expensive for the town, spoken 20 quiet words to Imani's mother, and never been seen again. The trust that had quietly paid for Imani's university tuition and that her mother had always described, vaguely, as your grandmother's savings, as though a retired school teacher's savings could have covered 4 years at a private college without a second glance. Walter did not answer her questions. Instead, he reached into the mop bucket, retrieved a folded stack of dry clothing that had clearly been sitting there, waiting, since before Imani had even entered the station, a plain wool coat, socks, a pair of flat shoes in her size, and set them gently on the bench beside her. "There's a car outside," he said. "Black sedan. Parked on the east side. Driver's name is Marcus. He'll take you wherever you'd like to go tonight. A hotel, a friend's home, anywhere at all. No questions. Tomorrow, if you're willing, someone will come and explain everything you've just asked me. Everything, little sparrow. 50 years of it." He straightened, wincing slightly at his own knees, and picked the mop handle back up. "Your grandmother said you'd be ready when the moment came. She was rarely wrong about anything. I don't expect tonight to be the exception." He turned and pushed the squeaking bucket back down the corridor, and though Imani called after him twice, "Wait, please, wait," he did not turn around, and by the time she'd pulled the dry socks onto her freezing feet and stood to follow, he had vanished entirely, as though the station itself had simply absorbed him. Across the city, in 3 separate homes belonging to 3 men who had not spoken to one another directly in nearly a decade, 3 phones rang within the same 11 minutes. The first call reached a retired federal judge in his study, where he sat each night with a glass of unfinished scotch and a stack of law journals he no longer needed to read. He answered on the second ring, listened without speaking, and when the voice on the other end said only 3 words, "The trial ended," he closed his eyes for a long moment, set down the scotch untouched, and said, 50 years. 50 years, the voice confirmed. And the verdict? A pause. Guilty. The judge exhaled through his nose, something between relief and grief. Then it's time to open the file. The second call reached a man in his 80s living alone in a modest brick house 2 hours outside the city, a man who had once been the private investigator on retainer to a family whose name appeared on no public record anywhere, no matter how deep you dug. He listened to the same 3 words, and unlike the judge, he did not sit with them. He rose immediately, went to a locked cabinet in his study, and began pulling out a series of thick manila folders, dated, labeled, sealed, that had not seen daylight in over a decade. The third call reached a woman, not a man. The voice on the phone had simply assumed, wrongly, that all 3 recipients were men, which tells you something about how long it had genuinely been since anyone outside a very small circle had needed to think about this family at all. She was the estate's head archivist, 74 years old, and she had spent the better part of her career maintaining a single private collection that no scholar, no journalist, and no member of the public had ever been permitted to view. When she heard the 3 words, she smiled, the first real smile she'd allowed herself in months, and said simply, "About time." None of the 3 callers, nor the 3 recipients, would have described what was happening as a conspiracy. That word implied malice, or secrecy for its own sake, or a plot against someone. What was actually happening was something far older and, in its way, far stranger, the quiet conclusion of a process that had been running patiently and invisibly for half a century, a process with exactly one purpose and exactly one subject, and that subject's name, until 11 o'clock that night, had been Sterling Knox. The black sedan took Imani not to a hotel, but, at her own request, once she'd found her voice again, to the small apartment she still technically kept under her maiden name, a modest one-bedroom near the museum where she worked, which Sterling had never once visited in 11 years of marriage because he considered it, in his words, an unnecessary redundancy. She had kept it quietly, paid for out of her own museum salary, without ever quite admitting to herself why. Now, standing in its small kitchen at midnight in borrowed dry socks, she understood. Some part of her had always known this marriage would end. She had simply never imagined it would end like this, nor that it would end with a decades-old family secret cracking open like a fault line beneath her feet. She did not sleep. She sat at her small kitchen table with a handkerchief Walter had given her spread flat in front of her, running her thumb over the faded gold monogram, EV, and letting herself, for the first time in over 20 years, actually remember her grandmother. Not the soft, simplified version she'd carried in her heart since the funeral, but the real woman, Evelyn Vale, who had never once raised her voice, who had watched people, really watched them, the way a naturalist watches a creature in its own habitat, patient and unblinking, and who had said things, sometimes, that 17-year-old Imani had dismissed as the eccentricities of an old woman. Wealth magnifies character, her grandmother had told her once, sitting on the farmhouse porch, watching a neighbor's truck kick up dust on the gravel road. It never creates it. Give a cruel man money, and you'll see cruelty at a scale he never had the resources for before. Give a kind man money, and you'll see kindness the same way. Money doesn't change what's inside a person, little sparrow. It just removes every excuse they had for hiding it. At the time, Imani had thought it was simply grandmotherly wisdom. Now, sitting in the wreckage of a marriage that had just been publicly detonated for spectacle, she understood it had been something closer to a warning. Or diagnosis. The knock came at 9 the next morning. Imani opened the door to find a woman in her 60s, silver-haired, dressed with the understated precision of someone who had spent a career being underestimated on purpose. She introduced herself simply as Margaret, offered no last name, and asked, with old-fashioned courtesy, whether she might come in. "You knew my grandmother," Imani said. "It wasn't a question. I worked for your grandmother," Margaret corrected gently, settling into the chair across the small table, "for 31 years. And before you ask, no, I'm not going to explain everything today. That's not how this works, and frankly, I don't think you're ready to hear all of it in one sitting. But I'm going to tell you enough to make sense of last night, and enough, I hope, to help you understand that what happened to you on that stage was, in the end, the least important thing that happened last night." Imani felt something in her chest tighten. Then what was the most important thing? Margaret folded her hands on the table, and when she spoke, her voice carried the careful weight of someone who had rehearsed this conversation for years, in case the day ever came that she'd have to deliver it. "Your family, Imani, the Vale family, is old. Older than this country's oldest fortunes, though you'd never find that fact written anywhere, because your family made a decision, roughly 200 years ago, to disappear from public record on purpose. Every generation since has done the same. You were raised not knowing the scale of what your family actually built, not because anyone was ashamed of it, but because your great-great-grandmother believed something your grandmother believed after her, and something the family still believes today, that wealth, when it's visible, distorts everything it touches. It distorts how people see you. It distorts how you see yourself. Worst of all, Margaret's eyes flicked briefly toward the window, toward the city beyond it, toward, Imani understood, the ballroom 6 blocks from here where she'd stood barefoot the night before. It distorts how the people who love you behave, once they know it's there. "So you hid it," Imani said slowly. "From everyone, including me." "We hid it from you most carefully of all," Margaret said, "because you were never meant to inherit an empire, Imani. You were meant to inherit a test." The word landed strangely in the small kitchen. Imani felt the hair rise on her arms. "A test," she repeated. "For 200 years," Margaret continued, "every heir of the Vale family has lived exactly the way you've lived. Modestly, under an assumed simplicity, building a life on their own merits, without the family fortune ever touching it, so that when they eventually fall in love, as every heir eventually does, The person they fall in love with falls in love with them. Not with money, not with a name, just a person. She paused. And once that person becomes a spouse, once the relationship has time to deepen, to test itself under ordinary pressures, the way ordinary marriages are tested, the family begins to watch. Quietly, thoroughly, not to trap anyone, not to punish anyone, to understand who that person truly is, when they believe no one of consequence is watching. Imani's mouth had gone dry. You watched Sterling. For 11 years, Margaret confirmed. Every decision he made. Every partner he cheated in a deal he thought no one would trace. Every debt he hid from you. Every night he came home late and lied about where he'd been. Every kindness, too. And there were some, in the early years, real ones, which is exactly why this was never a foregone conclusion. Nothing was decided in advance. Imani. That's the entire point. Sterling wasn't investigated the way a criminal is investigated. He was simply observed the way a scientist observes an organism in its natural habitat, and every choice he made, freely, without coercion, believing himself unwatched, became part of an answer to a single question. What question? Margaret's expression softened, just slightly, with something that might have been sympathy. Whether he deserved to be trusted with what you actually are. The silence that followed stretched long enough that the refrigerator's hum became audible. The traffic outside the window became audible. Imani's own pulse became audible in her ears. Last night, Margaret said, finally, at that gala, in front of 300 witnesses and every camera in the city, Sterling Knox delivered his final answer. And I think, if you're honest with yourself, some part of you already suspected it was coming. Some part of you has suspected for a very long time that the marriage was hollow underneath. What you didn't know is that his answer wasn't just ending your marriage. She reached into her bag and withdrew a slim leather folder, setting it gently on the table between them, unopened. It was ending everything he'd spent the last 5 years secretly building his empire on top of. Imani stayed at the folder without touching it. What's in there? The beginning, Margaret said. Not the whole story. You're not ready for the whole story yet. And frankly, neither is he. But enough for you to understand that by the time you walked off that stage last night, Sterling Knox's world had already started collapsing, and he doesn't know it yet. He won't know it for days, maybe longer. She stood, smoothing her coat, and looked down at Imani with an expression that carried, for the first time, something like genuine warmth. Your grandmother always believed you'd handle this moment with grace, when it finally came. I watched you walk off that stage last night on a security feed a friend of mine happened to have access to. And I have to tell you, she was right about you. She usually was. She moved toward the door, then paused, hand on the frame, and turned back once more. One more thing, she said. The trial your family conducted on Sterling Knox, the 50 years you keep hearing about, it wasn't only about him. It never is. Her eyes met Imani's, steady and unreadable. It's about all of you. Every generation. And Imani, yours isn't over yet either. It's only just beginning. Then she was gone, and Imani sat alone at her small kitchen table with an unopened folder in front of her, her grandmother's handkerchief still pressed beneath her palm, and the first genuine question of her entire adult life finally taking shape in her mind. Not who is Sterling Knox, which she'd spent 11 years believing she already knew, but who, exactly, am I? If this story is already getting under your skin, that's exactly the feeling I want you sitting with, because we've barely opened the first door. Take a second and drop a comment letting me know. Has a story ever made you question something you thought you understood about your own family? I read every single one. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button, because what's waiting on the other side of that folder is only the first of 8 secrets this story is going to pull out from under Sterling Knox's feet. Sterling woke the next morning to 11 missed calls and a headline he genuinely believed, for the first 3 seconds of reading it, would help him. Billionaire Sterling Knox publicly ends marriage at charity gala. The article's tone was breathless, scandalized, and, crucially, from Sterling's perspective, enormous. By 9 a.m. it had been picked up by 4 major outlets. By 11, his name was trending. He sat in the marble kitchen of the Knox penthouse, still in yesterday's dress shirt, scrolling through the coverage with something close to satisfaction, because in Sterling's experience, attention, any attention, had always eventually converted into leverage. "You're pleased with yourself," said Celeste Harrow, letting herself in without knocking, as she'd done for the better part of 5 years now. She was 43, sharp-featured, dressed even at this hour like she was walking into a negotiation, and she dropped a folder of her own onto the marble counter. Quarterly figures, the real ones, the ones that hadn't been shown to the board. "You should be terrified instead. It's exposure," Sterling said. "Exposure is currency." "Exposure," Celeste said flatly, "is the thing that happens right before people start asking questions you don't have good answers for." "Sterling, the Aurelius board is meeting at noon. 3 members have already called me this morning asking whether the foundation's finances are stable, which is a very specific word for people to suddenly start using." She opened the folder and turned it toward him. "We are 11 days from a debt covenant deadline you have not mentioned to a single board member. You told me the divorce would free up liquidity through the prenup clawback. It hasn't happened yet. And now you've made your personal life the top news story in the country at the exact moment you need everyone to believe your business is boring and stable." Sterling's jaw tightened. "The clawback will happen. Imani signed a prenup 11 years ago. She has no claim on anything." "She doesn't need a claim," Celeste said. "She needs a lawyer with a camera crew outside the courthouse, and after last night, every lawyer in this city would represent her for free just for the publicity." She closed the folder. "You didn't divorce her strategically, Sterling. You divorced her theatrically. There's a difference, and it's going to cost you." Sterling stood, crossed to the window, and looked out over his skyline that had, for over 2 decades, made him feel like a man standing at the exact center of the world. This morning it looked, for the first time he could remember, slightly less solid than usual. "She'll disappear," he said, more to himself than to Celeste. "She always disappears when things get difficult. She'll go stay with some friend, cry for a week, and by the time the lawyers finish, she'll take the settlement and go quietly. That's who she is. That's who she's always been." Celeste studied him for a long moment. Something crossed her face that looked, briefly, like doubt, not about the plan, but about him, about whether the man she'd spent 5 years positioning as her path to greater influence had just made a catastrophic miscalculation about the one person in his life he claimed to understand best. She said nothing about it, though. Instead, she picked up her folder and headed for the door. 11 days, she said. "Fix the covenant, or the board meeting today won't be the only fire we're putting out this month." Alone in the penthouse, Sterling poured himself a coffee he didn't drink and looked again at his phone, at photographs from the Gala already circulating, at Imani's face in the moment before she'd asked her question. That strange, steady calm he'd dismissed at the time as shock and was, this morning, beginning to feel less certain about. "Are you certain this is how you want history to remember tonight?" It had sounded, in the moment, like the desperate dignity of a woman with nothing left to lose. This morning, replaying it in his memory, it sounded like something else entirely, something closer to a warning delivered by a person who already knew exactly how the story would end. He told himself it was nothing. He told himself Imani Vale had never had a single secret in 11 years of marriage that he hadn't already known about, because there had never been anything to her worth hiding. That had been, if he was honest, one of the things that had eventually bored him about her, the sense that he already understood every layer of who she was within their first year together. He believed that, completely, for exactly 6 more days. The folder Margaret had left with Imani did not, as it turned out, explain everything at once. Margaret had been telling the truth about that. What it contained was smaller and stranger, and more disorienting for its smallness. A single black and white photograph, decades old, of a young woman standing in front of a farmhouse that Imani recognized instantly as her grandmother's, except that in the photograph, the farmhouse looked freshly built, the paint bright, the porch not yet worn soft by decades of weather. The young woman in the photograph was unmistakably Evelyn Vale, but beside her, hand resting lightly on her shoulder, stood an older man in an expensive suit that looked entirely wrong beside the farmhouse's modest simplicity, a man whose face Imani did not recognize and whose expression, even frozen in a photograph 70 years old, carried an unmistakable weight of pride. On the back, in handwriting Imani recognized instantly as her grandmother's, 3 words: the first trial. She spent the following week trying, quietly and without much success, to return to her ordinary life. She went back to work at the museum, where her colleagues treated her with the careful, over-gentle sympathy reserved for people who have recently become the subject of viral gossip, and where she found herself, for the first time in 11 years, unable to summon the practiced composure that had always let her float above other people's opinions of her. She moved fully into the small apartment. She retained a lawyer, not out of any appetite for a fight, but because Margaret had gently insisted it would be wise, and Imani was beginning to understand that when the people connected to her grandmother's world offered advice, it was worth taking seriously. She did not hear from Sterling at all for 6 days. On the 7th, her lawyer called to tell her that his legal team had filed for an expedited settlement under the terms of the prenuptial agreement, a filing that, per its language, would leave Imani with almost nothing beyond a modest one-time payment and full severance from anything bearing the Knox name. "Is moving fast," her lawyer said. "Faster than I'd expect, honestly, for someone with his resources. It's almost like he's trying to close this out before something else happens." Imani, sitting at her kitchen table with her grandmother's photograph propped against a coffee mug, found she was not surprised at all. "Let him," she said. "Imani, you could contest this. Given the coverage, given public sentiment, a judge would almost certainly let him," she said again, more quietly. "Sign whatever he wants signed. I don't want a cent of Sterling Knox's money." She looked at the photograph, at her grandmother's face, 70 years younger and utterly certain of something Imani was only beginning to glimpse the edges of. "I'm starting to understand that I was never going to need it." The second folder arrived 9 days after the gala, delivered not by Margaret this time, but by the elderly private investigator whose late-night phone call had set the whole quiet machine back into motion. A man who introduced himself only as Harold, and who sat across from Imani in her small kitchen with the weary, careful bearing of a man who had spent a career documenting other people's worst decisions and had never once enjoyed a single page of it. "Your grandmother hired me in 1974, he said, setting a much thicker folder on the table than Margaret's had been. "I was young then, ambitious. I thought I'd been hired to protect the family's fortune from fortune hunters. It took me almost a year to understand that wasn't the job at all." "What was the job?" Imani asked. "To watch," Harold said simply. "Not to interfere. Never to interfere. That was the rule, the only rule that mattered. Drilled into me on my very first day and repeated every year after. Whoever your family's heirs chose to love, we watched them live their real life. Not a performance for us. They never knew we existed, but their actual, unwatched life. Every decision made when a person believes no one significant is looking is the truest thing about them there is." He opened the folder. Inside were photographs, financial records, transcripts, a life's worth of quiet documentation. "This is Sterling's file. 11 years of it. I want to be honest with you, Imani, because I think you deserve honesty more than almost anyone I've ever sat across from in this line of work. It isn't entirely damning. There were real years, early on, when he was kind to you in ways that had nothing to do with performance. Years when I documented things I genuinely admired." His expression tightened. "And then there were the last 5. He turned the folder toward her. What followed was not a single revelation but a slow accumulation of them. The kind of mounting evidence that doesn't arrive as one thunderclap but as 100 small, quiet betrayals stacked one on top of the other until their combined weight becomes unbearable. Secret meetings with Celeste Harrow that had crossed, 18 months ago, from professional into something else entirely. A pattern of loans taken against company assets without board approval, used to cover personal debts Sterling had never once mentioned to Imani, debts from investments that had quietly failed while he continued, publicly, to project an image of effortless success. A private investigator of his own, hired, ironically, to dig into Imani's background, searching for any hidden fortune he might have suspected but never confirmed, a search that had turned up nothing because the Vale family's secrecy ran 200 years deeper than any investigator Sterling could afford was capable of penetrating. And beneath all of it, in Harold's careful documentation, a pattern that ached worse than any single betrayal, the slow, steady withdrawal of a man who had once, in the earliest years, genuinely loved his wife, replaced gradually by a man who had come to see her as an accessory, a decoration, a thing that had stopped serving its purpose the moment it stopped being useful to the story he was telling about himself. Imani closed the folder before she'd finished it. Her hands were not quite steady. "Why are you showing me this now?" she asked. "The trial is over. You said so yourselves. The phone calls, the verdict, all of it happened the night of the gala. What does it matter now what he did?" Harold's expression, for the first time since he'd sat down, showed something almost like tenderness. "Because the trial was never really about deciding whether Sterling deserved you," he said gently. "It was about making sure that when this moment came, when the marriage inevitably ended, one way or another, because your grandmother always believed it eventually would, you would not spend the rest of your life wondering whether you'd imagined the parts that hurt. Whether you'd been too sensitive, or too suspicious, or unfair to a man who perhaps deserved more patience than you gave him." He tapped the folder gently. "This isn't ammunition, Imani. It's proof. Proof for you, more than for anyone else. So that when you walk forward from this, and you will walk forward from this, you'll walk forward knowing exactly what happened, and exactly who you were living with, and exactly why none of it was your fault." Imani sat with that for a long moment, looking at the closed folder, feeling something inside her chest that had been clenched tight for 9 days finally, slightly, begin to loosen. "There's something else," Harold said, and his voice shifted, taking on a weight that made Imani look up sharply. "Something I think you need to know before you decide what to do next. It concerns the foundation. Sterling's foundation, the Aurelius Foundation, the one he stood in front of the night he divorced you." "What about it?" "It's not stable," Harold said. "It hasn't been stable for over a year. Sterling has been quietly using foundation assets, charitable assets, Imani, money donated by real people for real causes, as informal collateral for personal loans he can't openly disclose. It's not fully illegal, not yet, not in the narrow technical sense as lawyers have structured it to avoid, but it is exactly the kind of arrangement that collapses the moment anyone official starts looking closely. And people," he said, holding her gaze steadily, "are about to start looking very closely. Because of the gala," Imani said slowly. "Because of the gala," Harold confirmed. "Public spectacle draws public scrutiny, and public scrutiny is the one force in the world that even the most careful, well-connected people cannot fully control. Sterling didn't just end his marriage on that stage. He drew a spotlight onto every part of his life he'd spent 5 years desperately trying to keep in shadow." He closed his own copy of the folder and stood, buttoning his coat. "Your family never punished anyone, Imani. That was never the tradition, and your grandmother would want you to understand that clearly. We only ever watched and waited and let people's own choices become the whole of their story." He moved toward the door, then paused, the same way Margaret had paused 9 days earlier, as though the family's oldest servants had all learned, across decades, the exact same instinct for a meaningful final sentence. "Sterling Knox's story," Harold said quietly, "is about to be told in full, whether we intervene or not. The only question left, Imani, the only one that actually matters now, is what kind of story you decide to tell alongside it." He left her alone with 2 folders, a black and white photograph of a woman she was only beginning to truly know, and a decision that would, over the following weeks, reshape not just her own life but the lives of everyone who had ever underestimated exactly who Imani Vale really was. She sat at her small kitchen table long after the light outside had faded to evening, turning her grandmother's photograph over in her hands, reading the 3 words on the back again and again. The first trial. Not the last one. She understood now. Not even close. Somewhere in this city, a family archive held the full weight of 200 years of quiet observation, of hearts tested and revealed, of fortunes never spent to solve a single problem that patience and character couldn't solve better. And somewhere in that same archive, Imani was beginning to suspect, sat a portrait of her own, waiting, as it had waited, apparently, since long before she'd even met Sterling Knox, for the moment she'd finally be ready to claim it. What she did not yet know, what would not become clear to her until the estate car finally carried her. Weeks later, through iron gates she'd never once seen despite having heard her grandmother describe them in half-remembered bedtime stories, was that the Vale family tradition held one final layer even Margaret and Harold had not yet told her about. A portrait that had been hanging, waiting, in the estate's great hall for 11 years already. Sterling's portrait, already framed, already mounted, its plaque covered by a single piece of black cloth that no one had been permitted to remove until the trial reached its verdict. That verdict had been delivered 9 days ago, in a ballroom full of cameras, by Sterling Knox himself, in his own voice, in front of 300 witnesses. He simply didn't know it yet. If you've made it this far into the story, I want you to take a second and really sit with what Imani's about to walk into. Because everything you think you understand about this family right now is still only the surface. There are secrets in that estate that reach back 200 years, and every single one of them is about to come rushing to meet Sterling Knox at the exact moment he thinks his life is finally stabilizing again. If this story has already pulled you in, drop a comment and let me know how it's making you feel right now. I promise you, it only gets more intense from here. And if you haven't yet, hit subscribe. Because what happens when Sterling finally receives his invitation to the Vale estate is unlike anything you've seen in a story like this before. 3 weeks passed before Sterling Knox understood, fully and finally, that something in his life had gone catastrophically, irreversibly wrong. It began the way these things always begin, not with a single collapse, but with 100 small refusals, each one explainable on its own, each one only becoming sinister in aggregate. A board member he'd known for 15 years called to say he'd be stepping back from active involvement at Aurelius, citing family reasons that didn't quite make sense given the timing. A bank that had financed 3 of his last 5 acquisitions declined to extend a routine credit line, offering only a clipped email about revised risk assessments. A law firm that had represented Knox Capital for a decade sent a letter, not a call, a letter, the coldest possible medium, informing him they would be withdrawing from all active matters, effective immediately, citing a vague and unelaborated conflict. He called each of them personally. Each conversation followed the same pattern, warmth curdling into evasiveness, evasiveness curdling into a hurried excuse to end the call. Nobody would say what had actually changed. Nobody would name a reason. It was as if some current beneath the surface of his entire professional world had shifted all at once, and everyone connected to that current understood exactly why except him. It's the divorce coverage, Celeste told him, though even she didn't sound convinced of it anymore. She sat across his office in a chair she'd occupied 1,000 times over 5 years, but for the first time, Sterling noticed she'd stopped sitting the way she used to sit, leaned in, engaged, invested in his success as though it were her own. Now she sat back, arms crossed, watching him the way you watch weather that might or might not be about to ruin your plans. It's not the coverage, Sterling said. The coverage died down 2 weeks ago. This is something else. He'd started saying that phrase more and more in recent days. Something else, because he genuinely didn't have a better name for the sensation of watching his entire carefully built world quietly withdraw its support, one relationship at a time, without ever telling him why. Have you talked to Imani's lawyer? Celeste asked. About the settlement. She signed everything 2 weeks ago, Sterling said. No fight. No counteroffer. Nothing. He'd found that, if he was honest, more unsettling than a fight would have been. A fight he could have understood. A fight was leverage, was negotiation, was the language he'd spoken fluently his entire adult life. Silence, total and uncontested silence, was a language he didn't know how to translate. That's not normal, Celeste said quietly. You know that's not normal, right? A woman gets humiliated on a stage in front of 300 people and every camera in the city, and she signs everything without a single objection, without a single public comment, without even hiring one of the vulture attorneys who'd have taken her case for free just to be associated with a story that big. She shook her head slowly. Sterling, I've spent 5 years telling you Imani was the least interesting part of your life. I need you to understand. I think I was wrong. I think she was the only part of your life you never actually understood." Staling said nothing to that, because some cold, unwelcome part of him had begun, over the preceding 3 weeks, to suspect exactly the same thing. Then, on the 24th day, the letter arrived. It came by courier, not mail, a heavy cream envelope, sealed with wax, addressed in a fountain pen hand that looked like it belonged to another century. There was no return address. Inside, a single card, the paper thick and expensive in a way Sterling, who had spent 30 years around genuine old money learning to recognize its textures instinctually, immediately understood to be the real thing. Not new wealth performing old wealth. The genuine article. One sentence, in that same antique handwriting. "Your evaluation is complete." Below it, an address he didn't recognize, and a date 4 days out. He read it 7 times before he called the only person he could think of who might explain it. His own private investigator, the one he'd quietly hired 2 years earlier to dig into Imani's background, back when some instinct he'd never fully examined told him there was more to his wife than she let on and he'd wanted, for reasons he told himself were merely due diligence, to know what it was. "I need everything you ever found on Imani's family," Sterling said. "Everything. Even the parts you told me weren't worth including in the report." There was a long pause on the line. "Mr. Knox," the investigator said finally, his voice carrying a strange, careful weight, "I told you 2 years ago that the trail went cold. That was true. But I also told you, if you remember, that a trail going that completely cold on a family that old usually means one thing." "What thing?" "That somebody with real resources doesn't want it found. I chased that family's history back 4 generations and it just," the investigator exhaled, stopped. "Cleanly. Deliberately. I've done this work for 22 years, Mr. Knox, and I've never seen anything erased that thoroughly. Whoever the Vales actually are, they didn't get lucky staying hidden. They built the hiding." Staling looked down again at the cream envelope in his hand, at the sentence written in that antique hand. "Your evaluation is complete," and for the first time since the night of the gala, felt something colder than confusion settle into his chest. Something closer to Faye. If you've been with this story since the beginning, you already know something Sterling doesn't. That everything unraveling around him right now isn't chaos. It's design, patient and deliberate, 50 years in the making. If that kind of quiet, generational justice is something that moves you, go ahead and drop a comment below telling me whether you think Sterling deserves whatever's waiting for him at that address. Because I promise you, what's coming next is going to make you feel this story in your chest. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now's the moment, because everything up to this point has just been the setup. The estate did not announce itself the way Sterling had expected old wealth to announce itself. There were no towering gates with a gold-lettered family crest, no security booths staffed by men in sunglasses, no long, manicured drive designed to make a visitor feel small before they'd even reached the front door. Instead, the black sedan that had collected him from the city, sent, apparently, by whoever had written that letter, its driver offering nothing beyond a polite nod and a locked partition of silence for the entire tower drive, turned off a quiet country road onto a gravel path lined with old oak trees, and the estate simply appeared, unhurried, the way something that has never needed to impress anyone eventually reveals itself. It was enormous, but it did not look enormous. It looked old, genuinely, weathered old, stones softened by 2 centuries of rain, ivy climbing one entire wing with the unmistakable patience of growth nobody had ever bothered to trim back for the sake of appearances. There was no fountain out front performing well for arriving guests. There was a garden, slightly overgrown, clearly tended by someone who loved it rather than someone paid to make it look loved. Staling stood at the base of the front steps for a long moment before he could make himself climb them. The door opened before he reached it, and an elderly man in a plain dark suit, the same steward, though Staling had no way of knowing this, who had stood 3 tables back at the Aurelius Gala and set down his water glass the moment Sterling opened his mouth to speak, welcomed him inside with a small, unreadable bow. "Mr. Knox," the steward said, "they're expecting you. If you'll follow me." The interior was nothing like Sterling had imagined on the drive over, when his mind had conjured images of gilt-edged excess to match the scale of whatever fortune could erase a family from public record this thoroughly. Instead, the halls were quiet, lined with dark wood and old rugs worn soft by generations of footsteps, lit by real daylight through tall windows rather than chandeliers. It felt, more than anything, like a family home that had simply never stopped being lived in, except for the portraits. The portraits lined the entire length of the great hall the steward led him through, and Sterling, despite the tight knot of dread sitting in his chest, found himself slowing to look at them. Dozens of faces across what was clearly centuries of dress and style, men and women in the fashion of 100 different decades, each framed in matching dark wood, each mounted with a small brass plaque beneath it. He read the first one without quite meaning to. A woman in a high-collar dress from what looked like the 1890s. Beneath her face, the plaque read, "Accepted." The next, a man in a suit that placed him somewhere in the 1920s, on it. Another, "Trusted." He slowed further, his pulse climbing without his permission, scanning face after face, decade after decade, every single plaque carrying some version of the same quiet verdict, until he reached the end of the hall, where the portrait stopped being historical and became, unmistakably, recent. A woman he recognized instantly from the black-and-white photograph he had never seen but somehow, in this moment, felt he'd have known anywhere. Evelyn Vale, painted in her middle years, standing in front of the very farmhouse that had raised his wife. Her plaque read simply, "The Architect," and beside her, mounted, framed, already hung, a portrait of himself. Sterling stopped walking entirely. It was a formal painting, clearly commissioned from photographs rather than a sitting, but unmistakably him. The suit he'd worn to his and Imani's 10th anniversary dinner, the confident half-smile he wore in every professional photograph he'd ever approved for release. It had been hanging there, he understood with a lurch of vertigo, for some time. Long enough that the frame matched the others in its patina, though it couldn't be more than a few years old. Its plaque was covered by a small square of black cloth. "Every heir's spouse receives a portrait," said a voice behind him, and Sterling turned to find the steward had been joined by 3 others, the elderly investigator Harold, whom Sterling had never met but somehow instantly understood belonged to this world rather than his own, the silver-haired woman who called herself Margaret, and, standing slightly apart from the others, in a plain gray dress with no jewelry at all, looking utterly unlike the woman who had stood barefoot on a ballroom stage 3 weeks ago and utterly, unmistakably like herself, Imani. Sterling felt the floor tilt slightly beneath him. "Imani," he said, and her name came out smaller than he intended, stripped of the easy authority he'd always carried when he said it. She looked at him for a long moment. Not with hatred. He'd have understood hatred, would have known exactly how to defend against it, how to argue with it, how to eventually wear it down the way he'd worn down every obstacle in 30 years of building an empire. What she looked at him with instead was something far more disarming, something almost like sorrow. "Hello, Sterling," she said quietly. "What is this place?" he asked. "What is?" He gestured helplessly at the hall of portraits, at the covered plaque hanging beside Evelyn Vale's painted face. "What is this?" It was Margaret who answered, stepping forward with the same careful, rehearsed weight she'd carried into Imani's kitchen 3 weeks earlier. "This is the Vale family archive, Mr. Knox. It has documented every spouse to marry into this family for over 2 centuries. Not to punish them, not to trap them, to understand them, fully, honestly, without the distortion that visible wealth creates in every relationship it touches." She gestured down the length of the hall, at all those painted faces stretching back through history. Every single person in this hall married into a family whose true resources they did not know existed. They built their marriages, made their choices, revealed their true characters, entirely unaware they were being observed. And when the observation concluded, when enough years had passed for a genuine pattern to emerge, each of them received a verdict. "A verdict," Sterling repeated numbly. "Accepted, when they proved worthy of full trust," Harold said. "Which meant, eventually, full disclosure," the true scale of the family's holdings revealed to them at last, and a life built afterward on complete honesty between partners, with the money simply becoming one more shared resource in a marriage that had already proven itself sound without it. He paused, and rejected, on the rare occasions a spouse revealed, through their own free choices, that they could not be trusted with what they didn't yet know they might one day inherit access to. Sterling's eyes went back to the black cloth covering his own plaque. His mouth had gone dry. "Your evaluation began the day you married Imani," Margaret said. "It did not conclude until 3 weeks ago, on a stage, in front of 300 witnesses, when you demonstrated, in your own words, freely chosen, entirely unprompted by anyone in this family, exactly who you had become." She looked at him steadily. "We didn't write your story, Mr. Knox. We only read it. Every page of it was authored by you." "This is insane," Sterling said, though the words came out without much conviction behind them, a reflex rather than a belief. "You're telling me you've been, what, spying on my marriage for 11 years? That's illegal. That's—" "Nothing was recorded that wasn't already visible to anyone paying genuine attention," Harold said calmly. "We didn't wiretap your offices, Mr. Knox. We watched patents, public records, the testimony, freely given, of people who worked with you and around you and occasionally against you. We watched who you became when you believed no one of consequence was watching. And I want you to sit with that phrase for a moment, because it's the entire heart of what this family has always tested for. Not whether a person is good when they're being observed. Everyone manages that. We tested whether you were good when you believed you weren't." Sterling turned, slowly, to look at Imani, who had said nothing throughout this entire exchange, who stood watching him with that same unreadable sorrow. "You knew," he said, "all this time. You knew what I was being tested for, and you let me." "I didn't know," Imani said, and her voice, though quiet, carried a steadiness that stopped him cold. "Sterling, I didn't know any of this 3 weeks ago. I found out the same night you humiliated me on that stage. The same night I stood barefoot in the rain because you decided the cheapest way to feel powerful was to take a woman's dignity away from her in front of cameras." She let that sit for a moment, watching something flicker across his face, the first real flicker of shame Sterling had allowed himself in weeks. "I have spent 11 years loving you honestly, Sterling. Simply, without ever once knowing what you now know about my family. I never used it as leverage, because I never had it to use. Whatever choices you made across those 11 years, every kindness, every cruelty, you made them believing you were simply married to a museum coordinator with a modest inheritance and a quiet life. Nothing about who I actually am changes anything you actually did." Sterling had no answer to that. He looked, instead, back toward the covered plaque hanging beside his own painted face, and something in the set of his shoulders finally broke. "Show me," he said quietly. The steward stepped forward. With a slow, deliberate motion, he reached up and removed the square of black cloth. One word, engraved in brass, beneath the portrait of Sterling Knox. "Rejected." Nobody in the hall spoke for a long moment. Sterling stared at the word as though it might rearrange itself if he looked hard enough, as though the letters were negotiable in the way every obstacle in his professional life had, until this moment, always eventually proven negotiable. "There has to be an appeal," he said finally, and even as the words left him he heard how small they sounded, how unlike the man who had once stood on a gala stage commanding a room of 300 people with a single sentence. "Oh, a review. Something. You can't just—" "There's no appeal, Sterling," Imani said gently, and it was the gentleness, more than anything, that finally seemed to reach him. Not cruelty, not triumph, just the quiet, exhausted kindness of someone delivering news she genuinely wished were different. "Because this was never a court. Nobody put you on trial for a crime. You were simply given 11 years to be yourself, freely, without anyone interfering. And you were, Sterling, you were, for the first few years. I remember those years. I loved those years." Her voice caught, just slightly, the first real crack in her composure since she'd walked off that stage 3 weeks ago. "But somewhere along the way, You decided that the version of yourself worth protecting was the one that looked successful in photographs, and the version worth discarding the moment it became inconvenient was the one who actually loved me. And that wasn't a test I designed, Sterling. That's in decisions you accumulated without our involvement whatsoever. And Imani, she said, turning to the woman beside her with a warmth that had been entirely absent from her voice while addressing Sterling, goes home to begin the next chapter of a story her grandmother started 50 years before she was even born. The board meeting at Aurelia's Foundation, held 6 days after Sterling's visit to the Vale estate, lasted exactly 40 minutes and ended his tenure as chairman by unanimous vote. The forensic auditors, brought in not by any Vale family maneuver, Sterling would later learn, but by his own increasingly nervous board members responding to entirely legitimate financial irregularities his own choices had created, found exactly what Harold had warned Imani they would find: charitable assets quietly leveraged as informal collateral for personal debts, structured just carefully enough to avoid outright criminal charges, but not nearly carefully enough to survive genuine public scrutiny once the spotlight of the Gala had drawn every interested eye toward his finances. He was not arrested. He was not, in the end, even sued. Imani, when asked directly by her own lawyer whether she wished to pursue any claim against him beyond what the prenuptial agreement already guaranteed her, said only, "No. Let him keep whatever he still has left to keep. I want no part of anything that was ever his." But an empire built as publicly and theatrically as Sterling's requires public confidence to survive, and public confidence, once withdrawn, does not return on request. Within 4 months, Knox Capital had been quietly dissolved into a series of smaller, unremarkable holdings, sold off to competitors who had spent years waiting patiently for exactly this kind of opportunity. Celeste Harrow left the wreckage 2 weeks before the dissolution was finalized, taking with her a modest severance and no public comment beyond a single line to a reporter who caught her leaving the office for the last time. "I built my career believing character was a luxury successful people could afford to skip. I was wrong about that. I hope, someday, he figures out he was too." Sterling Knox, once a man whose name had opened every door in the city, found himself, within a year, living in a modest rented apartment 2 hours outside the city he'd once dominated. Not destitute, not truly. The world does not often deal in such tidy poetic justice, but reduced, thoroughly and permanently, to a life built on whatever genuine competence remained once every borrowed advantage had been stripped away. He took a job, eventually, at a mid-sized consulting firm, using the parts of his old skill that had always been real: his instinct for structure, his genuine intelligence, the parts of himself that had once, briefly, made Imani fall in love with a man who didn't yet have anything to prove. He watched, from that quieter life, as Imani Vale's name began appearing in headlines of an entirely different character than the ones that had once surrounded his. If this story has stirred something in you, that particular ache of watching someone finally face the truth of who they let themselves become, take a moment right now and let me know in the comments whether you believe people like Sterling can ever really change, once the mirror's finally been held up to them. I read every comment. And this next part of the story, I promise you, is going to hit even harder. If you haven't subscribed yet, this is the moment, because what Imani builds next is the entire reason this story exists. Imani Vale became chairwoman of the Vale Family Trust on a quiet Tuesday morning, in a private ceremony attended by fewer than 20 people, none of them press, most of them the same quiet, elderly servants of the family's long tradition who had spent decades watching, waiting, protecting a secret that had finally come home to the person it was always meant to belong to. She did not hold a press conference. She did not grant a single interview about her marriage, her divorce, or her husband's collapse, no matter how many outlets offered increasingly absurd sums for the exclusive. What she did instead, in the months that followed, was quietly astonishing to everyone who had expected the traditional aftermath of a story like hers: the vindictive lawsuit, the tell-all memoir, the carefully staged victory lap designed to humiliate the man who had once humiliated her. She launched, instead, a series of foundations that bore no trace of the Knox name at all, funded not with headline-grabbing single donations designed for maximum publicity, but with a patient, Structural generosity her grandmother had always believed in, scholarships for first-generation university students, housing initiatives in 3 cities that had been quietly overlooked by every other major philanthropic effort in the region, a rural hospital network built specifically to serve towns, like the one her grandmother had raised her in, a museum restoration project that finally allowed Imani to fold her own genuine professional passion into the family's vast quiet resources. Every project, without exception, carried some echo of Imani Vale's philosophy, the belief that wealth's only real value lay in what it revealed and enabled in the character of the people who wielded it, never in what it could purchase for its own sake. A journalist, granted one of the only interviews Imani ever agreed to in that first year, a careful, respectful profile for a magazine that covered philanthropy rather than gossip, finally asked her the question everyone in the country had been asking since the night of the gala. "How did you know," the journalist asked, "that your husband would eventually betray you the way he did?" Imani considered the question for a long moment, sitting in the same museum office she'd worked from for over a decade, surrounded by the quiet, unglamorous objects of a career she'd genuinely loved and never once needed to fake. "I didn't know," she said finally. "I want to be honest about that, because I think the honest answer matters more than the satisfying one. I fell in love with Sterling the way anyone falls in love, hopefully, imperfectly, without any guarantee of how the story would end. My family's tradition wasn't built to predict outcomes. It was built to protect something more fragile than that." She paused, choosing her next words carefully. "I simply believe every person deserves the freedom to reveal themselves honestly over time, without an audience distorting who they become. My grandmother believed that money, when it enters a relationship too early, doesn't test a person's character. It replaces the test entirely, because suddenly every kindness is suspect and every ambition is compromised by what's visible on the other side of the table. She wanted better than that for the people her family loved. She wanted us to be loved, and to love, as simply as anyone else gets to." Her eyes drifted briefly to a small framed photograph on her desk, her grandmother, young, standing in front of the farmhouse that had raised them both. Sterling wasn't punished for failing a test he never knew he was taking, if that's what you're asking. He was simply given 11 years of freedom to become whoever he was always going to become. I think, in the end, that's a kinder process than most people ever receive. It's just rarely a comfortable one to watch play out. 2 years after the night of the gala, Sterling Knox visited a cemetery on the outskirts of the county where the Vale estate stood, having learned, through channels he never fully explained to anyone, though it's likely Harold had quietly permitted it, in the belief that some final piece of closure belonged to him regardless of the verdict already rendered, the location of Imani Vale's grave. He stood before the modest headstone for a long time, in the kind of gray afternoon light that makes cemeteries feel less like places of grief and more like places of simple, unhurried honesty. He had rehearsed, on the drive there, 100 different things he might say to a woman who had died believing she'd correctly predicted exactly the kind of man he would eventually become. In the end, he said nothing at all. It was the groundskeeper, an old man who introduced himself only as having served the Vale family for decades, who found him there and handed him, without a word of explanation, a small sealed envelope that had apparently been left with instructions decades earlier, instructions specifying it should be delivered to Sterling Knox, and Sterling Knox alone, if and only if he ever came looking for this particular grave of his own accord. Sterling opened it there, standing in the gray light beside the headstone of a woman he had never met and who had, nonetheless, quietly shaped the entire trajectory of his adult life. The handwriting was the same antique hand from the letter that had summoned him to the estate 2 years earlier, Imani Vale's own, written, the groundskeeper told him, decades before Sterling had even met Imani, as part of a set of letters she had prepared in advance for every possible outcome her granddaughter's future marriage might reveal. "If you're reading this," it began, "it means you loved our granddaughter once, and it means, eventually, you stopped. I want you to know that I do not hate you for that. Hatred was never part of what my family built, and I would be disappointed in anyone who tried to turn my life's work into an instrument of it. I want you to know something else instead. The fact that you loved her at all, genuinely, in whatever years that was true, tells me that goodness once lived inside you. I watched enough people, across enough decades, to know that emptiness cannot fake real tenderness convincingly for long. Whatever you felt for Imani in your early years together was real. I believe that. I hope, someday, wherever you are when you read this, you find your way back to whatever part of yourself was capable of feeling it. I am not angry with you, Sterling. I am only disappointed, and I suspect, if you are the kind of man capable of standing at this grave at all, that disappointment will hurt you far more than my anger ever could have. I hope you prove me right about that too. E.V. Sterling stood in the cemetery for a long time after he finished reading, the letter trembling slightly in his hands, the particular weight of a hatred he'd have known how to defend against replaced by something far heavier and far harder to argue with. He folded the letter carefully, placed it in his coat pocket, and for the first time since the night of the gala, for the first time, if he was honest with himself, in longer than that, allowed himself to simply grieve. Not for the empire he'd lost, for the version of himself Evelyn Vale had glimpsed, briefly, decades before he'd even known her name, and had believed, right up until the end, might still be worth finding again. 5 years after the night of the gala, a young couple walked through the doors of the newly opened Vale Foundation Community Center, in one of the 3 cities where Imani's housing initiative had finally broken ground. A modest but dignified building, nothing ostentatious, exactly the kind of quiet, functional generosity Evelyn Vale had spent her whole life believing in. They came for a free tutoring program for their daughter, a bright, curious 7-year-old who perched on the edge of her chair in the waiting room, watching the adults around her with the particular unblinking patience of a child deciding whether a new place was safe. Nobody in that waiting room knew, could have known, would have had no reason to suspect, that a distant, deliberately unremarkable branch of an old, careful family tree had quietly, patiently traced its way, generation after generation, to exactly this child, sitting in exactly this room, watching exactly this world with the same steady, perceptive curiosity that had once, decades earlier, made an elderly janitor in a rain-soaked train station recognize a grown woman by nothing more than the particular way she watched the world around her. The tradition, quiet and unbroken, continued. Imani Vale, watching from the doorway of the community center she'd built in her grandmother's honor, did not know this either, not yet, not for many years still to come, because that was never how the tradition worked, and she, more than anyone alive, understood exactly why it never would. Some things she had learned across 5 long years of building an entirely new life out of the ashes of a marriage that had taught her, in the cruelest possible way, exactly who she really was. Some things were only ever meant to be discovered slowly, honestly, one true choice at a time, by people who did not yet know they were being watched at all. She thought, sometimes, of the question that journalist had asked her all those years ago. How did you know he would betray you? And she understood now, with the clarity that only distance and healing can provide, that the real answer had never been about prediction at all. It had been about faith. Faith that character, given enough freedom and enough time, would always eventually reveal itself. Faith that the truest test of any person was not what they did while being watched, but who they chose to become when they believed, entirely and mistakenly, that no one significant was watching at all. Sterling Knox had failed that test, freely and entirely of his own choosing. Across 11 quiet years no one had ever forced him to walk through. But somewhere in a rented apartment 2 hours outside the city, a man who had once stood on a gala stage and stripped his wife of her ring, her watch, her shoes, and her dignity in front of 300 witnesses sat, 5 years later, with a letter from a dead woman folded carefully in the drawer of his desk, and tried, quietly, privately, with no audience left to perform for and nothing left to prove, to become, at last, a man his own daughter, had he ever had one, might have been proud to call her father. Whether he ever fully succeeded, no portrait in that quiet estate hallway would ever record. Some verdicts, Evelyn Vale had always believed, were never meant to be final. They were only ever meant to be honest. And if there's one thing this story has tried to leave you with tonight, it's this: The people who truly test our character are rarely the ones watching us most closely. They're the moments when we believe no one is watching at all. If this story moved you, if it made you think even a little differently about what real wealth actually means, do me a favor and share it with someone who needs to hear it tonight. Drop a comment and tell me the biggest lesson you're walking away with. And if you're not already subscribed, this is exactly the kind of story we tell here every single week. So hit that button, settle in, and I'll see you in the next one.